Hello everyone, welcome to my talk on testing React Apollo client. Thank you GraphQL Summit for organizing this virtual conference during the pandemic and having me here to present. I'm Adhithi Ravichandran. I'm a software consultant based in Kansas City. I primarily work on React, React Native, and GraphQL. I'm also a Pluralsight author and love speaking at conferences. Quality means doing it right when no one is looking. This is a quote by Henry Ford, which is applicable to our software development world as well. Writing good tests result in creating better software products and with higher quality, which are prone to fewer errors. In this talk, I'm going to walk you through testing your GraphQL operations with Apollo client in a React application. In this talk, we're going to be testing React components that use the Apollo client. We're going to be testing queries and mutations that we've written in GraphQL. We'll also test the error and loading states as well. Before we get into testing, let me show you the application that we're going to be testing. This is Global Mantix, a demo conference app that I've built with React. In here, you should see a conference tab, which has two options to view speakers and view sessions. Each one of them is going to pull up information using a GraphQL query. The view speakers is going to pull speaker information from a GraphQL server, and the view sessions brings in the conference sessions. Let's go ahead and inspect this to understand the GraphQL operation. When I right-click and inspect, you should see on the Network tab the GraphQL operation. In the request payload, you can see the query for speakers. And on the response, you see the JSON response back that I've got from the GraphQL server. Now, this is what we're going to test. We're going to test that our mock query that we're going to create returns a JSON response as expected when we pass it to the React component. We're going to use the marked provider for our tests. We're going to wrap the component tree with the marked provider as shown in this example above, which makes the Apollo client available on React's context. This is very similar to using the provider component, but here we're going to use the marked provider for marking responses. This is going to enable you to define mark responses for individual queries and mutations, and the tests don't need to communicate with an external GraphQL server. This means your tests are going to be very reliable and totally depend on your mark responses. All right, let's get started. Here we are in VS Code, and I have a file called speakers.jsx, and this is what we saw right now on our web application. I use a query called speakers query, which is quite straightforward, and it queries the GraphQL server for the speaker information. And once I get the speaker information that I need, like ID, name, and bio, I simply display them on the web page. So let's create a test for the speakers. I'm going to go ahead and call that speakers.test.js. First things first, we need to import our marked provider, which is available from the Apollo client /testing. The next thing I'm going to use is Enzyme's mount operation. This is going to create the React components that I need. And then we're also going to get our queries imported, like the speakers query, and the React component that we're going to test called speakers. All right, so speakers is a component that calls a speakers list, and this is where we call our query to query for speakers and display them. I've included a bunch more imports that we're going to utilize within our test, like act and wait. The first thing we're going to do in this test is to define our marked speaker data. The marked speaker data needs to match our query and the response exactly. We can't miss parameters. We're going to get errors if we do. And the marked response is going to have a request and a result section. Within our requests, we can use the query parameter and give the name of the query that we're going to test. In our case, it's going to be called the speaker's query. And within the results, we're going to return exactly what we're expecting the result of this query to be. I'm going to paste the response that we're going to mark. It's going to have the speakers array with the ID, name, bio, sessions, and each session has an ID and title and a feature tag as well. Now remember that you can add as many speakers as you want in your mark response, and we can add as many sessions per speaker as we'd like. So I'm going to keep this simple and have just one speaker in our array. Now ready to create our first test since our marked data is available. In this test, we're going to pass this marked data and make sure that our React component is called and returns a response as expected. We're going to be using the mount method that's going to remount a component if it's not currently mounted. And this comes with enzyme. And we're going to wrap our components with the marked provider as we talked about earlier. And the component we're testing is the speakers component, which in turn calls the speakers list and calls the GraphQL query and displays the speaker information. Now to our marked provider, we have to pass a few parameters. I'm going to pass the parameter add type name and set it to false. By adding the type name, we're going to prevent Apollo client from automatically adding a special type name field to every object that it queries for. In addition, we're also passing the marked data to the parameter marks. Once we have this set up, I'm going to introduce a wait. By doing that, we're going to wait for our component to update, and I'm going to call an update function on our wrapper. Once that's done, our GraphQL query operation is hopefully finished, and now we can start asserting the results. I'm going to expect some item from our response to match what I'm expecting. So let's say we're going to take the panel heading, which displays the name of the speaker. So I'm going to find the panel heading class name to have text speaker Adhithi Ravichandran, and that's what I've sent in my mark response. So let's see if that works out. So let's go ahead and run our test. We have a task called npm test, which runs for the app. So it's going to run this test, and you just see that our test passed. So our rendering speaker data passed. You could always add plenty of other expectations and assertions here to make sure that every field is returned as you expected. So I'm going to add one more, maybe to check the panel body, and that's supposed to display the bio information. The bio information that we passed says bio : here is my bio. Let's update our test and see if that passes. And it passed again. This test validates that our speakers component that has an Apollo query that it uses to return data does work as expected. Now, there are other things we can improvise on this test. We looked at a scenario where the speaker data has rendered. There are other states like loading and error that we can test as well. Before the data has been rendered, the function returns a loading state where it displays a message that says loading speaker. So this might be a good time to include that as a part of our test to ensure that the loading speaker message is displayed when the GraphQL response has not come back. To do that, I'm going to remove the async awaits that we had earlier, which means it's going to be a synchronous call, and it's highly likely that the call doesn't complete before this test finishes. So we're going to have the call made, but it's not asynchronous, so it's probably going to be in the loading state. I'm going to copy the text that we want to assert, which is loading speaker, and I'm going to expect that text to be displayed. All right, let's hit save now and see if this test passes. Ouch, looks like our test failed, but it didn't seem like it's failed for a big reason. There seems to be a typo, so I'm going to fix that. And let's try again. All right, both our tests have passed, one for rendering the speaker data and another one for loading. Now we can follow the same method to write a test for error conditions as well. To do that, I'm going to create another marked object. This time, it's not going to return a result or response. Instead, it's going to throw an error. All right, I've pasted a test for rendering with error. And this time, instead of passing the marked speaker data, we're going to pass the marked error data that we just created to our marked provider. It needs a quick update to ensure that it's pulling in the error data and placing it as an array of marks. Let's try running our tests now. And there you go. All the 3 tests have passed, and we've validated that from our React component, we've called the Apollo client's useQuery method. We passed in a marked GraphQL query with responses, and we validated that our speaker data rendered along with the loading states and the error states. Isn't it pretty neat? Now we could follow the same method to also test mutations. So I can show you an example of how we can do that with mutations. All right, we're back to our application. This time we're going to click on View Sessions. And this is where I display all the sessions for the conference. And we're going to look at specifically the submitting a session. Clicking on that brings a form. And this is where we're going to be able to submit a session to the conference. Now this is a GraphQL mutation, and it's going to take in the values entered in this form and create a GraphQL mutation call and update the GraphQL server. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to say sample session, blah, blah, day, Wednesday, and level, intro. Now, before I hit submit, I'm going to inspect and get into the network call. And there you see it. We get a message that says session submitted successfully. And you should see a GraphQL response here that says create session and returns back the data, which includes the items that we just entered into the form. And if you take a look at the request, you see that there is a mutation that takes in these variables here: day, description, level, and title. Now, the next task for us is to write a test to validate that this mutation occurred successfully. Let's try that out. We're back to our IDE, and you see my mutation create session, and it takes in the session as the input and returns some data back as a response. Now we're in our session form component, and here I'm using the hook use mutation, and it takes in the create session mutation. And recall that mutations return a mutate function, and here our mutate function is the create function, which is invoked when our form is submitted. So this is kind of the description of our UI, and we're ready to test it. I've created a test file called create_session.test. Here you can see that just like the test we wrote for the queries, we have a test which has marked data, and within our marked data, we have the request as well as the result. In the request, we give our query parameter as a name of the mutation, which is create session, and we pass in the variables that the mutation needs, which is the session info. Keep in mind that here sometimes you may run into errors if you miss fields. Your mark object needs to match exactly what was sent to your mutation request and the response that comes back from your mutation. So make sure to match the variables and the response. I have our create session test written already. It's very similar to the test we've seen before with the queries. We have the marked provider, which wraps around the session form. In this test, we also click on the button to submit the form, which triggers the mutation. And you can notice that our test has passed, which means it validated that the marked data it received returned the mutation and the response back correctly as we expected. To learn more about testing, make sure to check out the official document from Apollo GraphQL, and they have a section on testing React components that we just covered in the talk. They also talk about different types of errors like GraphQL errors which can be tested, as well as testing with a cache. You can also learn other types of testing, like testing using TypeScript and marking schema capabilities from this document as well. And that's a wrap to this talk. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to learn more about consuming a GraphQL API with Apollo Client in React, I have a course on Pluralsight, which I've linked above on the slide. Make sure to check it out. I also have another course on Pluralsight called GraphQL The Big Picture, and this course is for someone who's interested in learning about GraphQL from scratch and learn the differences between GraphQL and REST and why GraphQL is even a good option. All right. I'd like to thank GraphQL Summit again for having me here to give a short talk on testing. You can reach me at Adhithi Ravi on Twitter and reach out to me for any questions or simply say hi. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks.